The DA says it's an insult to South Africans that government ministers no longer have to pay for water and electricity. It's emerged a change to the Ministerial Handbook has lifted the cap on their municipal bills. The party wants the president to scrap what it calls outrageous provisions. Let's get reaction from the DA's Dr. Leon Schreiber. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, Leon. And many of those watching these developments unfold would say it's almost a slap in the face, given the current economic climate that we are in, when it is decided that incentives for ministers would increase to the level of the fact that they no longer have to pay for their water and electricity. Surely government would have had to have read the room, which clearly they did not.
Yes, good morning, Rofhiwa, and good morning to the viewers. No, they certainly did not, but I do think that it probably goes a bit deeper than that even, because these particular amendments have actually been in force since April already. There was no communication from the president at that time about these changes to the Ministerial Handbook, which is his prerogative to make. And I think if you go back to April, you'll recall that there was a very big issue at that time about increases in electricity prices. So I suspect, unfortunately, that this was a deliberate effort not to inform the public about these very substantial and significant changes. And in fact, I only managed to track it down eventually because my antennas picked up something that was said in a parliamentary committee meeting. But I then had to ask a question to the minister and eventually obtain a new version of the handbook. So it's only through that we actually know about this change. And I think that in itself is very concerning. The second thing is obviously the point that you raise, which is many South Africans, in fact, I think all South Africans have lost access, reliable access to electricity. And large parts of Gauteng have lost reliable access to water, and many other parts of the country as well. So the idea that taxpayers should now be paying the electricity and water bills for ministers, when it is those ministers' failure that have robbed those same taxpayers of access to water and electricity, is really quite a slap in the face.
So what would you then say to arguments that have been made since the news of this altered ministerial handbook have come out, that the handbook should be scrapped entirely because obviously it does not serve anyone but those in power who, as you've just indicated, a very large part of them are not doing what they are put in place in those ministerial positions to do?
Yes, so that is exactly one of the avenues that the DA is currently exploring. You know, I must be honest with you, I've been in Parliament for about 3.5 years now, and this issue is one that I've been working on over that period. And every few months, there's a new bit of information that we release to the public about luxury flights for retired ministers. You may recall earlier this year, we released information on 20 million rand spent for luxury vehicles for ministers during the COVID lockdown period. Now there's this information about ministers no longer having to pay their own water and electricity bills, and it really is just something where you say enough is enough. And I certainly have reached that point, and we are going to be looking into challenging not only this particular provision, but also the entire logic of the Ministerial Handbook. Because, as I mentioned at the start of this, it happens entirely without parliamentary oversight. I'm a member of Parliament of the committee in which this handbook is supposed to be situated. And none of us had any idea about these changes until we had to do months of digging actually to find it out. That is absolutely unacceptable. It is unacceptable that President Ramaphosa can, by the stroke of a pen, essentially force taxpayers to pay millions more for luxury vehicles or for electricity and water bills. And so that is one of the avenues we're going to explore. In terms of the Executive Ethics Act, also going to explore whether we can launch investigations through perhaps the Public Protector to look into whether the president is abusing his power by simply giving carte blanche on these services to ministers.
Yes, and that, of course, Leon, speaks to issues around oversight. The fact that these agreements can be done in secret and then found out after investigations by colleagues within Parliament is quite worrying, because it also brings up something that you raised, in that over 2 million rand was spent by the Department of Public Works to buy ministers generators for their homes. That in itself was not something that was public put out there. It's something that was also discovered in terms of all these perks that they're receiving. that we are none the wiser about, but we are paying our taxes, and it's going to instances of this nature. And so oversight here is going to be absolutely key going forward. And of course, that investigation into the president's powers and how he uses them going forward.
Yes, what I would flag, though, is that I mean, pressure does work. We have achieved some successes over these 3 years that I'm talking about. You might recall this issue of ministers, after they retire, they used to have basically unlimited business class flight tickets for their whole lives, which were paid by you and me as taxpayers. That has been dramatically reduced and brought into the purview of the Ministerial Handbook, where previously it was completely secret. And so that is one example of progress that we can make. Another example was also the fact that these luxury vehicles initially had no cap on them either. Okay. And through relentless public pressure, we were able to install a cap initially of 700,000 Rand per vehicle, which was still too much. But interestingly, in this latest version of the handbook, the president has also increased that again to 800,000. So you can see you have to be constantly vigilant here. But the point I want to make is that public pressure does work, and that is the avenue that we will certainly be following. And frankly, I think that ordinary South Africans should be following, to write to the president, to engage with the government and say that this is not acceptable. You mentioned the issue of the generators. It's quite interesting to note that that project was carried out by the Public Works Department of Minister Patricia de Lille. And if you look at these changes to the Ministerial Handbook, it is again Minister de Lille's department that is the one managing the payment of these water and electricity bills. So while it is the president who signs off on this, both the Minister of Public Service and the Minister of Public Works should also account for the fact that they didn't say no to this and are just essentially managing a process that's forcing South Africans to pay for water and electricity services that we no longer receive in many cases.
That's very true, and of course we'll continue to follow developments around here and hopefully get a representative from Presidency and those departments to account for these decisions. Thank you very much for your time this morning. That is DA MP Dr. Leon Schreiber joining us to speak about the amendments to the Ministerial Handbook, which were uncovered and of course really causing a bit of a stir in an already tough living environment for residents of the country.